2 Kings chapter 16. This chapter is kind of a rarity for 1st and 2nd Kings, where we're going to get a whole chapter on a king of Judah. We've had several chapters on Israelite kings, but this is one of the rarities where we get a whole chapter on a king of Judah. Well, let's just read it here. 2 Kings 16, verse 1. In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Yea, and he made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. And he sacrificed and he burned incense in the high places, and on the hills, under every green tree. And then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, he came up to Jerusalem to war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria, and he drave the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there to this day. And says, so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and he sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, and carried the people captive to Kir, and he slew Rezin. And the king King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the fashion of the altar, and the pattern of it according to all the workmanship thereof. And Urijah the priest built an altar according to all the king Ahaz had sent him from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it against King Ahaz, came from Damascus. And when the king was come from Damascus, the king saw the altar, and the king approached to the altar and offered thereon. And he burnt his burnt offering and his meat offering, and poured his drink offering, and he sprinkled the blood of the peace offering upon the altar. And he brought also the brazen altar, which was before the Lord, from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and he put it on the north side of the altar. And King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offering and the evening meat offering, and the king's burnt sacrifice, and the meat offering with the burnt offering of all the people of all the land, and their meat offering and their drink offering, and the sprinkle upon it the blood of the burnt offering, and all the blood of the sacrifice. And the brazen altar shall be from me to inquire by. Thus did Urijah the priest, according to all that King Ahaz commanded. And King Ahaz cut off the borders of the bases, and removed the laver from off them. And he took down the sea from off the brazen oxen that were under it, and he put it upon a pavement of stones. And the cover for the Sabbath that he had built in the houses, and the king's entry without, turned he from the house of the Lord for the king of Assyria. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaz which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Ahaz slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. And so here we have, again, a rarity, where this chapter is dedicated to a king of Judah. But we also have another rarity. Whereas we've talked about in the past, the Israelites never had a good king. They never had a godly king. It was just all bad for Israel. Judah was up and down. Sometimes they had good kings, sometimes they had bad kings. Ahaz seems to kind of take the title of the worst king that Judah ever had. And it came at a time where things could have turned a lot worse for Judah had God not been merciful to them. And we'll talk about that more towards the end. But following the 16-year reign of Jotham, his father, Ahaz begins his own. And again, 16-year reign. And as good as Jotham's was, his was bad. In fact, you could say his was worse. And so unlike the good reign of Jotham, the text tells us that he did not that which was right. He did not follow David. He didn't do anything really that he should have done. And so unfortunately for the nation of Judah, Israel was more of an influence on Ahaz than David was. And you can see, and we'll kind of develop this as we go along, Israel and the way that Israel were doing things was a strong influence on Ahaz. He shows, in the first few verses of this chapter really establish this, he shows an utter disregard for God. He shows an utter disregard for the covenant. As he not only, we see in verse 4, that he worshipped at the high places, it says on the hills, and under every green tree. And so he's not following the law with regards to the place of worship, was the temple. And with regards to the high places, it's likely, although we can't say for sure, but it's likely that the high places oftentimes were used, you might say out of good intentions, where the people might say, well, I'm worshiping Yahweh. I'm just going to do it here. It's more convenient to do it here than to have to go to Jerusalem. It's more convenient to do it here than have to go down to the temple. And so, but also we understand that there was also idolatry taking place at the high places as well. At best, the high places were simple disobedience to the location where the worship was supposed to take place. At worst, it was strict idolatry. But he did this, and you see under every green tree. It doesn't seem like this was just a thing of convenience for him. He was worshiping anywhere and everywhere other than the temple, and so this seemed to be a complicit disobedience. But even worse than that is what we see in verse 3, that he made his own son to pass through the fire. And so what we see here, whether this was to Molech, which was kind of the more well-known false god, or some other deity with a common worship practice where they would sacrifice their child to this false god. And we've talked about this in the past. There were quite horrific ways in which they did this. Just the act of its own is terrible, but the ways in which they did it make it that much worse. And so Ahaz was involved in this. And we get the sense just immediately how wicked this man truly was. And so chapter 15, what we looked at last week, if you remember back to last week, it showed us Israel's decline. Remember, there was king after king after king. They're all just getting assassinated. They're all wicked. And Israel is down to their final king. And so it showed us Israel's decline. And here we get a sense, and I would say a veiled warning in verse 3, that Judah would follow suit if the kings like Ahaz continued to be on the throne. If they continued to have men such as Ahaz, Judah was going to very quickly follow in the same footsteps of Israel. And again, at the end of verse 3, he says he causes his son to pass through, and then he says, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. In other words, God is saying, Ahaz is doing the very thing that I judged the Canaanites for doing. Ahaz is doing the very thing that I cast the people out of the land for doing. And if you go back and you read the Pentateuch, God very clearly told the Israelites, I'm casting them out. You are going to be my vessel of judgment for the wicked deeds of the Canaanites. And these are the reasons why they're getting kicked out of the land. But if you follow suit, if you do the same things, I'm going to kick you out of the land just like I'm doing them. And so here verse 3 is a warning. He's doing the things that caused them to get kicked out. If this stays, you will also be kicked out. Right? And so we understand, and the Bible is not silent on this, we understand that for both Israel and Judah, the reasons why they were eventually conquered, the reasons why the Israelites were eventually taken away, never to return, Judah was taken into captivity, the reason why these things happened had nothing to do with politics. It had nothing to do with the fact that maybe their military wasn't as grand and mighty as another nation's military. It had everything to do with the fact that they were wicked people facing the judgment of a holy God. That's why those things happen. And here we have, again, I think a veiled warning for the nation of Judah, which was, these are the kinds of things that cause God's judgment to reign. And if you don't want that to happen, men like this cannot be allowed to be on the throne. And so we get to verse 5. And so here we see this coalition. There's a coalition between Israel and Syria. And the Israelites and the Syrians come and attack Judah. Now, the scriptures never give us kind of the background on this. But the traditional thinking, and I looked into this a little bit, I didn't see anything that would contradict it. The traditional thinking on this is that Israel made an alliance, you could say, with Syria to try and combat the power of Assyria. And so as we've talked about, the Assyrians are the threat. They are powerful. Nobody's stopping them. And so these two nations that, had not had the greatest of ties, aligned together to try and stop Assyria. And here they want Judah to join in with them. And from everything we understand, Ahaz basically tells them, no, I'm not aligning with you. And it seems like what Ahaz wanted was not an alignment with people against Assyria. It seems like Ahaz wanted an alignment with Assyria. He wanted to be to have political ties with them. And so he tells them no. And so they decide to come down and destroy Judah. Essentially, if you're going to say no, we're going to attack Judah, we're going to take you out, and we're going to put somebody on the throne who will say yes. Right? That's exactly what they're trying to do. That much we do know. You can see as much in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah talks about this particular time, and the Israelites and the Syrians were going to kind of install a yes man as king in Judah. That's what they wanted to do. But we see that they were unable to do this. At the end of verse 5, it says they could not overcome him. And so they try to, they don't try, they do attack, but they were unable to gain a final victory. Now, what we know from Chronicles in particular is that Judah was sustaining mass casualties. This was not a sustainable war. It wasn't as if they were handedly defeating this coalition. No, they were taking bruises and losing soldiers left and right, losing land, and things, if they hadn't ended when they did, probably would have turned the other way. And so what Ahaz decides to do then is to go make that alliance that I think he probably always wanted to do. And so he reaches out to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he says, help, right? Help me. I need help. They're attacking me. Come help me. But the way in which he does this is wrong for two reasons. It's wrong for two reasons. And the first and most obvious is that nowhere in the text, nowhere in this in 2 Chronicles do we ever see that Ahaz ever sought the will of God about this. He saw a problem, and in his mind, he thought the only way out of this has nothing to do with God and has everything to do with a political alliance with this particular power. And so the first problem is the fact that he never consulted God. He never went to the priest and never did anything like that. He just had this idea, thought it would work, and ran with it. And then the second reason is the way in which he did this. And so he reaches out to Tiglath-Pileser, and he tells him, basically, I'm your servant. I'm your son, he even says this. And so he shows an authority to the king of Assyria that should have gone to no other but to God himself. And so this was, not only should he not have been doing it in the first place, but then when he decided to go through with it, he did it in the wrong way. And so this was a bad alliance all the way around. Now, if you just read through 2 Kings, you might think, well, it worked. It was successful. So what's the big deal? Because the king of Syria comes down, they attack Damascus, they take it. And again, as I said earlier, had they not done that, it's likely that the Judah would have fallen, unless he had reached out to God, which he never did. And that was Judah's downfall. Again, Judah's downfall was not that they were facing a power bigger and greater and mightier than they. Judah's downfall was that they had the greatest power and never reached into it. They had the greatest power available, and he never sought or had the faith to say that it would be that it would work for them. He never reached out to God again. He never goes to the priest. He just does what he wants to do in his human wisdom, and human wisdom will never match the wisdom of God. And so Ahaz has this problem on his hands. And so if he had only listened to the words of his forefather, if he had listened to the words of Solomon, which said, trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not unto thine own understanding, and all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. This is a promise we have from God. And yet Ahaz, again, you would imagine he would have been familiar with these words at best, but he does not take this advice. And so he may have survived the Assyrians, but he placed Judah as a vassal to the Assyrians. And that's a position that Judah should have never been in. And so again, we understand the pagan nation of Assyria was not the kind of nation that they needed to be aligned with in any way, shape, or form. And so again, he's already made bad decision, wicked decision, and so we see the religious influence now that Ahaz brings into the nation. And so that starts in verse 10. We won't reread all of it, but in verse 10, Ahaz goes to Damascus, probably as a way to, thank Tiglath-Pileser personally after their defeat of Damascus. And so he goes there, and while he's there, he sees this altar. Now, we're not told much about it. We don't really know what it looked like, how big it was, or anything like that. But there was something about that particular altar that captivated Ahaz. He saw it, he liked it, he wanted it. And so he immediately, and again, we're not told all the details here, but he gets the plans for this altar, the details for this altar. He sends them back to Jerusalem to the high priest. And this is something I didn't put in here, and I probably should have mentioned in my notes here. But you'll notice the kind of the silent work of Urijah in this chapter, who was the high priest. Maybe he did, but we're never told in the text that Urijah ever one time stood up to Ahaz and said no. Right? God has told us a way to do this. And what you're doing, what you're asking for, what you are commanding is against God. It is against the covenant. And again, not once do we have a record of Urijah saying, no, I won't do this. I won't commission the making of an altar that is pagan in origin and against the covenant. And then not only that, but then Ahaz takes out all the furniture. He moves around everything. And again, Urijah just kind of goes along with it. You see there in verse 16, thus did Urijah the priest according to all that the king Ahaz commanded. Notice it does not say that Urijah did according to what God commanded. He did according to what Ahaz commanded. And so Ahaz was successful in part but in bringing in his wicked intentions, in part because he had a priest, a high priest at that, who refused to stand up for what the scriptures were actually telling him to do. And so his silence was complicit in Ahaz's wickedness. And this is something that we have to understand. Yes, I might not have the voice or the power or the authority to make changes in our nation, but I also don't have the calling as a Christian to just sit back and say, well, just because I can't do anything about it, I just have to go along to get along. No, that's not what we're ever called to do as Christians. And if all the Christians in America would actually use the voice that we have, perhaps things would look significantly different in our country. But again, back to the altar. He sends the plans back. Urijah has it built. Now, whether he was the one who was involved in its construction, I doubt, but he has the altar built. And upon his return, Ahaz begins to sacrifice upon this new altar, okay? This pagan altar. And so this is very much reminiscent, and this is why I said earlier, that he had an Israelite influence and not a Davidic influence. And so he's very much like a second coming of Jeroboam. Jeroboam instituted false religion, and part of that was the way that they offered sacrifices and where they offered sacrifices. And so here Ahaz has this new altar built, a pagan altar for pagan reasons. And so again, he's like the Judah version of Jeroboam. And so what he does is he commands then that all the normal sacrifices that would normally be done at the temple to be done on this new altar. But not in the same place. They're not. He didn't replace it and put it where it's supposed to be. No, he moves that and the old altar, puts them in a new place, and says all the old sacrifices be done there. And I just want to say just something about that. This was probably Ahaz's way of saying, well, we're still following the covenant. I'm still having the burnt sacrifice every morning, every evening. Those burnt sacrifices are going on, just like God said. But the problem is that Ahaz does what so many people do, is that I'm going to do what God says, but I'm going to do what God says the way I want to do it. And this is what Ahaz did. Yeah, we're still doing the morning sacrifice, we're still doing the evening sacrifices, but not where God commanded, not how God commanded, not on the altar that God commanded. And so he could probably rest his head at night and think to himself and lie to himself, I'm still obedient, I'm still doing the things that I need to do, all while trying to subvert the very word of God. And so he has this new altar. He commands for all the normal sacrifices to be done upon that particular altar. And then he takes the old altar, the one that was in the temple, he places it near the new one, and then he says that one is going to be for me to inquire by. That's what the text says. The old altar would be used for Ahaz to inquire by. Now that's all that we get. That's all the information we're told. But what is likely being said here is that Ahaz, and I have to look at this word again, how to pronounce this. Ahaz was likely involved in the practice of extispacy. Extispacy. Now, I had never heard that word before. I don't know if you have ever heard that word before, but what extispacy is where they would sacrifice an animal and then they would read the entrails as a way to divine various omens to tell somebody their future, right? And so this was divination. That's what they were. This is likely what was happening, because he doesn't just say, this is going to be my altar for me to do my sacrifices. That's not what he says. This is my altar whereby I will inquire, right? And so to inquire, again, likely tells us that Ahaz was using it. And again, think about what an abomination this is. Taking the very altar that God commanded the Israelites to build, takes it from the place that God commands it to be, and then uses it as a means to divine, to be involved with witchcraft and sorcery, and what a fist. He's shaking his fist at God, and he's telling him again, I don't care about what you've commanded. I don't care about the covenant. I don't care about how you said things ought to be. This is what I want to do, and so I'm going to do things my way. And so this is a direct abomination against the very covenant and against the commands of God. But it doesn't stop there. And the language is a little difficult here, but he goes and if you go look at the plans for the temple, there were these 10 water basins, and there would be 5 along each side of the temple, and they were on bases, right? And so he went in and he dismantled the 10 lavers that would align the sides of the temple. And then there was a very large, again, it was essentially a water base, and it was a way for the priest to get ceremoniously clean. But again, go read the plans for the temple. And it was a very large water basin, and there was a very ornate base for that basin to sit upon, and it was made out of these bulls of gold, and there were 12 bulls, 4 facing each cardinal direction, and they were all made out of gold, and that large water basin sat on top of those bulls, and he took the base of that water basin, and he just put the water basin on a pavement of stones. He just replaced the bulls with stones. Now, we're not told why he does these things. I saw some people say, well, he took all the gold and the precious metals in order to pay off Tiglath-Pileser. That's possible. I saw some people say he used it just to decorate the palace. Again, that's possible. We're not told why he does it. And if we were supposed to know why, the scriptures would have told us. But what we can say is, even though we don't know why he did these things, we know he for certain did not have the authority to do these things. It doesn't matter what the why is. It doesn't matter what the why is, because there was not a reason that would have justified him coming in and dismantling the things that God commanded to be there. God never said, make these water basins and put them there unless a time comes where you need them. That was never there. It was just to be there. That was the command. So he did not have the authority to do what he was doing. Even as the king, he shouldn't have done this. I'll quote Robert Jameson here. He said, the sin in this affair consisted in meddling with and improving, according to human taste and fancy, the altars of the temple, the patterns of which had been furnished by divine authority. And so again, what does he say? I'm going to make the temple according to my image. That's what he's doing. Ahaz says, God made this according to how he wanted it. I'm going to make it according to how I want it. And again, you can see just through the reign of Ahaz and the limited information we get, just how self-centered and self-focused, selfish the King Ahaz truly was. Now, after his death, we get a couple of interesting things. It says that he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. That's what we read in Kings. However, when you add in the account of his death in Chronicles, we see that whereas he was buried in Jerusalem, he was not given the honor to be buried in the sepulcher where all the kings were buried. And so in 2 Chronicles, it says, and Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city, even in Jerusalem, but they brought him not into the sepulchers of the kings of Israel. And so in death, they honored the position. He was still king, but they did not honor the man, right? We will give you a burial in Jerusalem, but you will not be placed with these other godly men. And so the people recognized what a disaster Ahaz truly was. And so this is why I said at the very beginning, it was nothing more than the mercy of God that Judah was spared to live another day. Ahaz was trying to become, now whether that was intentional or not, whether he even recognized it or not, Ahaz was trying to become the Jeroboam of Israel. And why that matters is because as we have gone through the book of Kings, you have seen where every Israelite king has been compared to who? They have been compared to Jeroboam, right? Even if they did some good things, they would say, but they didn't undo the things that Jeroboam did. They continued in the sins of Jeroboam. And so here Ahaz is trying to become the Jeroboam of Judah. He's trying to bring in false worship. He's trying to take away from the temple of God, to try and take away from proper worship. And this is something that false prophets often do. They try to not only bring in false worship, but they try to do away with proper worship. Right? This is something that happens a lot of the time. And again, what will they say? Well, we're still doing the sacrifices, right? We're still doing the things that God tells us to do, but we're just going to do them how we want to do them. And so they bring in false worship. They do away with proper worship. And in so doing, he very easily could have led Judah to a place that was irredeemable, to a place where God would have brought judgment far sooner than what it eventually came. And so there was tremendous mercy. But then in the very end of the chapter, it says he was buried with his fathers, and Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his stead. Now, obviously, we haven't talked about Hezekiah yet, but you'll see that these two men were night and day different. As wicked and as terrible as Ahaz was, Hezekiah was a godly man who Judah needed at this particular time. In fact, one of the best kings that Judah, probably the best king of Judah, of the split nation, probably the best Judahite king that ever existed. Maybe Josiah would take that mantle, but Hezekiah was definitely one of the greatest that they had, and he came at a time that was very, very necessary. Again, Judah very easily, at this particular point, could have gone the way of Israel. But Hezekiah, God through Hezekiah, was able to bring the nation back to a point where they had a lot longer to survive and to thrive as a nation. And so they would still, we'll see this, they would face some hard times. They would face some difficult times, even while Hezekiah was reigning. But the difference between Hezekiah and Ahaz was that Ahaz cared about himself. Hezekiah cared about the will of God. And so we'll see that as we go through that. And so it just made me think of the Psalm 30, where he says, "Sing unto the Lord, O you saints of his, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness. For his anger endureth but a moment. In his favor is life." And so you can kind of get the sense there of Ahaz and Hezekiah. His anger endureth for a moment. In his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. And that was certainly the case for the people of Judah. And as always, we've said this many, many times in the study, but as the king went, so did the nation. And these two men kind of exemplified that particular truth.